Australian football in the modern era is a billion-dollar industry, a media magnet that dominates the airwaves year-round. Players are fitter and more skilled than ever before, under more scrutiny than all but our elected leaders, and now have the pay packets to match. When all is said and done each season, after the Premiership Cup is awarded and barely a moment has passed for the victors to bask in the glory, comes a time when tongues are set wagging and online clicks shoot through the ceiling, the AFL trade period. It seems that nobody is off limits these days. Loyalty is a commodity rather than an expectation, and big-name trades have become commonplace. But this trend didn't start overnight. In fact, it all began way back in December 1964 when the league's biggest name, having just captained a premiership at the peak of his powers, defected to a rival club. This is the story of the trade that changed football forever. Ronald Dale Barassi Jr. was born to be a Melbourne footballer. The only child of Ron Sr., as a teenager he wished for nothing more than to follow in his dad's footsteps by wearing the red and blue. Barassi's father, a consistent goal-kicking rover, played in the Demons' 1940 VFL Premiership, his last league game, before being tragically killed on war service in Tobruk the following year. Melbourne officials would keep a fatherly eye on the young Barassi throughout his early years, and by the age of 16, Ron Jr.'s ambition to wear a Melbourne jumper was aided by the newly introduced father-son rule. Watching his form at Preston Scouts, Demons selectors signed the young Barassi, with new coach Norm Smith, already a legend of the club for his playing career alone, taking Ron under his wing and offering him the use of his backyard bungalow. The relationship between Barassi and Smith was a special one.
He, very early in my football career, made sure that I kept my feet on the ground in such a way that the message really got home. So I've tried to do that ever since.
As Smith would later say, he was a bit difficult to handle when he was young. He was 16 and I was hard with him, I suppose, but there again, I was fair. He used to think I was exceptionally hard, but he realises now that whatever I did for him was only for his own good. This upbringing almost certainly contributed to Barassi's resilience on the field. Upon his debut in round 4 1953 as a 17-year-old, wearing his father's number 31, Barassi was given a nervous welcome to the MCG by Footscray legend Charlie Sutton, who played him for a fool by comically balking the young half-forward. Yet Barassi developed into a hardened-on baller over the next couple of seasons. Indeed, Smith developed a new position, the ruck rover, specifically for his protege, and team success would follow. As the champion side of the 1950s, the Demons played in 5 premierships from 7 grand finals between 1954 and 1960, Barassi a member of all. Accolades scattered among the flag years included 2 All-Australian Guernseys, a pair of club leading goalkicker awards, and the honour of captaining the 1960 success. If best on ground medals for grand finals had been awarded back in that era, Barassi laid genuine claims to deserve as many as 4. Seriously. His impact on the field was pronounced, and his ability to single-handedly take apart opposition teams was arguably unmatched. Playing a power game role, Barassi's legend grew not only because of his exquisite skill by hand and foot, not only his adept marking and prowess in front of goal, but his sheer determination and will to win. You could see it written all over the Melbourne captain's face at the end of every match. Utterly fatigued with nothing more to give, a character study in leadership and team play. It was often in those last 5 or 10 minutes of the final quarter where Barassi's stamina would will his team over the line. The Demons would continue to at least make the finals over the next 3 seasons as Barassi continued to add to his personal trophy cabinet, with more All-Australian honours and his first club best and fairest heading his way throughout this time. But it was 1964 that would simultaneously be the most momentous and tumultuous season in Barassi's career to date. Captaining the club to its 12th and his 6th VFL Premiership, the man known as Melbourne's Mr. Football also won his second club best and fairest award. With more than 200 league games under his belt and a glittering list of honours, Barassi was at the peak of his powers. It can't be understated how influential Barassi was at this point in time. There was no bigger name in town. As a way of illustrating this point, take a look at this October 12, 1964 edition of the Sydney Morning Herald. This is on the front page of the newspaper in a state still a generation away from having any sort of genuine Australian football presence. But Barassi's ubiquitous recognisability was made pretty clear. In a national broadcast this week, a Japanese student, who has been in Australia and is now acting as an interpreter for Australians at the Olympics, was asked who he believed was the best Australian sportsman. He replied, "I think Ron Barassi." Around the same time, Barassi was described by writer Brian Buckley in the Bulletin as, for Victorians, an institution and a symbol, a kind of apotheosis of football. The feature then suggested he was better known than the state premier. Starting to get the picture? Ron Barassi was revered, and that hero worship was on show all throughout Melbourne town. Kids everywhere had the number 31 sewn in their replica woolen jumpers. One Mount Waverley couple had named their Labrador Barassi. A Lilydale woman had taught her budgie to say, "Come on, Ron." And at the time, there was no risk in doing this. Big name players stayed put. Transfers, while obviously still a part of the game, were reserved for ageing veterans past their peak, bit part players looking for a new start, or ex-league footballers returning to the big time from a stint in the country. In 1960s Victoria, changing your football team was more of a sin than changing your religion. It was simply expected that the players would uphold that same ideal. So, what of Ron Barassi? He'd essentially achieved it all at a playing level. Leadership sat well with the champion midfielder, and he harboured coaching ambitions as his career progressed. Many pundits and observers prophesied that Barassi would take over Norm Smith's role as head coach once his playing role ended. In an early version of succession plan, Smith would become chairman of selectors and Barassi would effortlessly glide into the new position. But Barassi knew that even if such a scenario played out and the Demons continued their success, much of it would still be attributed to his predecessor. Even Smith himself thought that as much, that fans and journalists would feel that the wily old fox was still the puppet master at Melbourne, even if he no longer held the title of head coach. And so the first murmurings began, not even a week after the D's nail-biting premiership victory over Collingwood. Richmond was the first club to throw its hat into the ring publicly, having put the feelers out a couple of months earlier. At the time, Barassi was unmoved, focusing heavily on the task at hand, the upcoming final series. But now that the flag was won, he was happy to entertain offers, and in a prescient move much like the trade rumours of today, such chatter played out in the papers. "If Richmond wants me and it comes across with the right kind of offer, I'll certainly listen," Barassi said in The Age that week. Norm Smith's brother Len was actually in charge of the Tigers at the time, but they were languishing in a 21-year premiership drought and keen for a fresh start. Backroom dealings would certainly have taken place over the month ahead, but the news broken by the Herald's chief football writer Alf Brown on a Friday morning in early December 1964 put any Tiger talk to bed. Carlton, coming off the back of its worst season in VFL history, wanted Mr. Football to take the reins. The Blues were ready for upheaval, and there were some significant power brokers both within and outside the club who wanted to see change at the top. As the story goes, George Harris was the incoming president of Carlton, and his Progress Party committee aimed to coerce Barassi to the club by promising big dollars and a secure future. In truth, the seeds were sown more than a year earlier by a quartet of Carlton kingmakers who had their eye on Barassi. One of that group was Laurie Kerr, a champion Blue of the 50s, who invited Barassi to lunch in the city for a harmless chat. Naive to his intentions at the time, Barassi would twig onto the plan at least by Thursday, December 10th, 1964, when he was invited to another lunch, this time with a couple of members of Harris's board, and was unofficially propositioned with a job offer. £9,000 plus bonuses over 3 years for Barassi to be the playing coach of Carlton. The biggest deal in footy, ever. Barassi was taken aback. He called Melbourne secretary Jim Cardwell to explain. "Jim, this is what's happened," Barassi said. "I've told Carlton I'll consider it for a couple of days and say no, or let's talk further." But in the meantime, the power brokers had tipped off Alf Brown with the story. And so, Friday morning's Herald relayed the facts. The money was on the table. This angered Barassi, who called Carlton to immediately knock back the offer, unhappy with how circumstances were playing out behind his back. 2 days later, on the Sunday afternoon, the Melbourne Football Club was hosting its annual Christmas party at the MCG. Barassi attended with his wife and kids, but wasn't receiving the usual holiday greetings from his counterparts. Dirty looks from board members, sneering whispers behind his back, even a wisecrack from mentor Norm Smith, who suggested he was writing his own stuff in the papers. On the drive home, this began to weigh on Barassi's mind. "Gee, I've just knocked back a fantastic offer," he thought to himself. And so he picked up the phone, called Alf Brown, and the media merry-go-round creaked into action once more.
Where is your heart, Ron?
Right here, Mike.
Football-wise?
Well, I think your heart is where you are at the time.
A few days later, behind closed doors, Barassi would motion to Carlton that he was interested in the position. But a few more days passed, and his decision had swung back to no.
The opportunities for me were just, undoubted. So that was not even a question. It was just, the only question was, leaving Melbourne. And I changed my mind a couple of times, which for old Carlton must have driven them crazy.
Leaving his boyhood club, where his father made his name, where Norm Smith had made his name, where he had made his name, such a decision wouldn't be easy. Smith even offered to accelerate the succession plan and hand over the coaching role there and then, in a canny attempt to convince Barassi to stay. At Carlton, the heavyweights were also pulling the strings to win Barassi over the line at their end. Chief of them all, George Harris.
In a few hours, the Carlton Football Club committee will sit down at the committee table to make one of its most important decisions, to appoint a coach for 1965.
The pair conversed. Harris was persuasive, and it worked on Barassi.
Because I rang Barassi at 7:30 in the morning on the Tuesday, still in bed, and I harangued him, I begged him, I persuaded him to such an extent that 2 or 3 times my wife said, "For God's sake, leave the poor fellow alone. He can't take much more of this."
At the Carlton committee meeting on the night of Tuesday, December 22nd, 1964, as the clock passed 10 p.m, Ron Barassi was officially announced as playing coach for the next 3 years, beating out around a dozen other highly credentialed applicants.
Reapproached me and I've had second thoughts on it. Ron, I'm impressed with the way they're going about things. I'm impressed with the men behind the club. And I also feel, looking at their performances over the past couple of years, that they have great potential for a coach to take them up from 10th position.
Harris, as president, was overjoyed. But for he and his staffers, there was still work to be done. You see, Barassi had to be cleared from Melbourne before he was technically permitted to work with his new club, and the Demons weren't exactly about to make life easy. Melbourne president Don Duffy got on the offensive in the papers. "I don't think there'll be any worries about a clearance if Ron took over a position as non-playing coach," Duffy said, "but as a player with another league club, that could create problems." So while Barassi could relax over Christmas pudding, Carlton committee members had to manufacture some sort of peace offering to Melbourne in order to have their man cleared. In a TV interview with Channel 9 on December 27th, Norm Smith lent his public support to his protégé, saying Barassi was justified in asking for a clearance because of his service to the club. Nearly a month passed and there was still no ingress made. The Demons still wanted to play hardball, and this time they were taking it to the top. In deferring the clearance application, on January 22, 1965, Melbourne made a formal complaint to the Victorian Football League over the way Carlton handled its pursuit and subsequent signing of Barassi. Secretary Jim Cardwell charged Carlton with having approached Barassi without first getting permission from Melbourne. He wasn't a fan of the Blues' backdoor dealings and felt it breached league guidelines. Barassi, meanwhile, was stuck in the middle. He began to watch Carlton training sessions from inside the grandstand rather than directly from the Oval, not wanting to cause any more ill feeling between the two clubs. To the letter of the law, he could not coach or play with Carlton until the clearance went through. And as each day passed, with Melbourne's formal complaint still waiting to be addressed by the league, the actual clearance was well and truly on the back burner. Imagine Barassi's surprise when on February 5th, the Age revealed that Melbourne had withdrawn its complaint and would now begin clearance talks with Carlton. The kicker? It was that man George Harris, once again. Likely sensing the writing on the wall, Harris dipped his pen into ink one evening that week and scribed a lengthy apology letter to the Demons. In it, he described his committee as extremely distressed that the pair of clubs' relationships may be threatened, admitted that Carlton unintentionally committed a breach of VFL Permit Regulation 13, and asked the Melbourne committee to accept their sincere apologies. The Demons reacted positively to the letter, and, in a smart PR move, withdrew their complaint. It would now be only a matter of days before the football world would learn of Melbourne's decision on the clearance. Surely, given what had recently transpired, it could only go one way. League administrators were, up until this point, still keeping a close eye on the minutiae of the deal, despite Harris and Melbourne smoking the peace pipe on subsequent days. But during their meeting on February 10th, when they were due to make a decision on the since retracted complaint, the VFL voted unanimously that the matter was no longer in their hands. With another barrier breached, Carlton inched ever closer to officially getting its man. By nightfall on February 16th, they would know for certain. Cardwell called Carlton secretary Gerald Burke to deliver the news. 2 words printed on the next morning's Age told the story quicker than any article could. Best wishes. With a figurative pat on the back, Cardwell and the Melbourne Football Club thanked Barassi for his services to the club, wished him well, and officially granted his clearance to Carlton. 56 days after the Blues announced the arrival of Ron Barassi as coach, they finally had their man, and the 1965 VFL season was now even more eagerly anticipated by all. There was no doubt the pressure was on for Barassi to perform as coach, what with the huge sum of money that was thrown at him to coax him to Princes Park. And with a 37-point victory over Hawthorn away from home in the opening round, his first test had been passed. But supporters with a touch of theatre had already turned their eye to when the Blues and Demons would first meet, June 5th, round 8 at Princes Park. The Age described it as an acid test for Barassi and his moment of truth. This was to be a master versus apprentice matchup, and in this case, the master won out. A shockingly wayward Carlton booted 6-22 to lose by 37 points to Melbourne as Norm Smith had the last laugh. Smith employed ruck rover Brian Keneally to tag Barassi, shadowing him all afternoon, keeping the Demon champion relatively quiet. Most pertinently for Smith, it proved his side could still operate at a premiership level without their ex-star, or so it seemed. Post-match, in a somewhat bizarre showing of reconciliation, the Demons were presented with the R.D. Barassi Perpetual Trophy, which was to be awarded to the winner of each match between the two clubs from there on in. A fortnight later, Barassi would be out of the side with a thigh injury, and his weeks of rehabilitation suffered a further setback ahead of the round 13 clash against Geelong, when the champion midfielder tweaked his thigh at training for a third time that year, just 5 minutes before the squad was due to leave the track. It was tragedy for the Blues. They were still in the finals hunt, but were at a disadvantage without Barassi on the field. His brilliance, for now, was consigned to the coach's box. While Carlton scavenged for a backs-to-the-wall victory at Kardinia Park that Saturday, Barassi's former club Melbourne was floundering. It sensationally sacked coach Norm Smith on the Friday night in one of the biggest ever football shocks, and the stories from that debacle could probably fill another episode on its own. The Demons then lost to the lowly Kangaroos at Coburg the following afternoon, and the club was in turmoil. Among many reasons that Melbourne president Don Duffy gave for Smith's departure, one, the outgoing coach believed, was his support for Barassi's defection. Smith did not mince his words. "The club is slipping," he said. "I spoke to Ronnie. He could see it." Barassi would finally return to the playing field for the round 16 match against Collingwood, a must-win if the Blues were to keep their finals hopes alive. But an inspired best-on-ground performance from Pies big man Ray Gabalick dashed the Blues' hopes, and any success would have to wait another year. By this stage, the Demons had reinstated Smith as coach, realising the error of their ways, but the flame had been doused. They would only win one more game for the year, and Carlton under Barassi would finish the season above them on percentage. This may not have directly motivated Barassi for the years ahead, but it certainly would have fired up Harris & Co. The best and fairest count at the Blues saw Barassi finish 5th despite missing 7 matches, a reflection of the talent he brought to the table whenever fit to play, and the club was satisfied with his efforts in the coach's box. To briefly touch on the rest of Barassi's Carlton career, it was undoubtedly a huge success. 1966 saw the Blues win another 10 matches but narrowly miss finals, before finishing second in 1967, preceding a straight sets finals exit. In 1968, Barassi achieved greatness, coaching his side to a thrilling 3-point premiership win over Essendon. With his playing days essentially over by now, Barassi again coached his side to another grand final appearance, this time losing in 1969 to Richmond, before the greatest grand final comeback of all in 1970, 44 points down at half-time to defeat Collingwood by 10 points in front of more than 121,000 spectators. Following the conclusion of the 1971 season, where the Blues missed finals by half a game plus percentage, Barassi retired from the role and the sport at large to focus on his business career. While we know that in the years to come, Barassi would add further pages to his glittering storybook, at that point in time he could only be judged on whether the move to Carlton was a success, and in every facet it was.
It was the best thing that I ever did in my football life, was to break away then as a coach. No, I've got no doubt about it.
Not only did Barassi deliver 2 long-awaited premierships to the proud traditional club, his protracted transfer from Melbourne to the Blues paved the way for every big-name trade in the decades following it. There will never be another episode quite like it. Ron Barassi's move truly was the biggest trade in football history.